Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Lewis Fisher's Indigo, which, if you're not familiar, is an incredibly powerful excerpt from the life of Mahatma Gandhi that maps out a massive turning point in modern history. We're going to unpack Gandhi's very first successful satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance, in Champaran, Bihar. It's a completely fascinating look at how one highly localized dispute over farming practices ended up fundamentally altering the trajectory of an entire nation.
To kick things off, we really have to ask, how exactly does a massive movement actually start? You know, it rarely begins with some grand sweeping declaration. Usually, it starts with a single, highly specific grievance and one person who simply refuses to give up. All right, let's jump right into Part 1, the call to Champaran and Rajkumar Shukla's plea.
Our story kicks off with a man named Rajkumar Shukla. Now, Shukla was a poor peasant from Champaran. He wasn't a politician. He certainly wasn't wealthy, and he didn't have any kind of massive platform. But what he did have was this relentless, absolute plea for justice against a system that was literally crushing his community financially. He knew he needed help, and he set his sights on Mahatma Gandhi.
And this turns into an incredible story of pure persistence. Gandhi was, as you can imagine, an incredibly busy guy at the time, deeply involved in politics and social issues all over the country. So when Shukla made his initial request and was essentially brushed off because of scheduling conflicts, he didn't just go home. No way. He literally followed Gandhi everywhere. I mean, he shadowed him for months, tracking him to his ashram in Ahmedabad, and all the way to Calcutta, just flat out refusing to be ignored. Finally, struck by the sheer stubborn tenacity of this peasant, Gandhi says, okay, and agrees to visit the village to see the situation for himself.
So, what exactly was the massive problem they were facing when Gandhi finally arrived? That brings us to Part 2, the Tinkatya system, and a story of deeply unfair cultivation. The core issue really came down to a stark division of agricultural land. The British landlords who controlled these estates in Champaran forced the local farmers to grow indigo on exactly 15% of their land holdings. The remaining 85% could be used for other crops, sure, but that 15%, totally non-negotiable. This was known as the infamous Tinkatya system.
Now, what's really insidious about this system is how it caused such heavy losses and brutal exploitation for the peasants. We're not talking about your standard landlord-tenant agreement here. The entire indigo harvest from that 15% had to be surrendered directly as rent. It was a deeply oppressive agricultural policy designed to keep the farmers perpetually disadvantaged and entirely at the mercy of the British landlords.
But then, the situation went from bad to just completely unmanageable. Why? Because of a sudden leap in global technology. Germany had just developed synthetic indigo, and boom, it disrupted global agricultural trade practically overnight. This breakthrough immediately tanked the demand for the natural indigo being grown in Champaran. The crop was essentially worthless. But instead of simply releasing the farmers from that 15% agreement, the landlords ruthlessly demanded unfair financial compensation from the peasants just to be freed from a contract that was completely useless anyway. The farmers were actively being extorted.
And this blatant extortion sets the stage for a major historical turning point. Let's move into Part 3, Civil Disobedience, the first victory. The crucial conflict plays out incredibly fast. First, as soon as Gandhi begins investigating the peasants' claims, the British authorities order him to leave Champaran immediately. In Phase 2, Gandhi flat out disobeys the order. He refuses, making it clear he feels a higher moral duty to help the poor farmers. This leads to Phase 3, where he's summoned to appear in court for his defiance. But Phase 4, that's where the magic happens. Thousands of peasants gather spontaneously to support him. Finally, totally overwhelmed by the sheer numbers in Phase 5, the government is forced to withdraw the case entirely.
Just try to picture the sheer scale of this moment. Thousands of peasants gathered at the courthouse in an unprecedented display of solidarity. These were people who had been absolutely terrified of the British landlords for generations, yet seeing one man stand up for them without raising a single fist, they mobilized. They completely overwhelmed the authorities, proving that the power of the masses, when united and peaceful, is an absolute force to be reckoned with. As Lewis Fisher notes in the source material, this single, powerful moment marked Gandhi's very first victory using truth, nonviolence, and civil disobedience in India. It was basically the ultimate proof of concept for a strategy that would eventually dismantle an entire empire. Getting the charges dropped was huge for sure, but how did they secure justice for the actual financial extortion? Let's explore that in Part 4, the 25% victory and restoring self-respect. So Gandhi didn't just protest and call it a day, he was incredibly meticulous. He and his team carefully collected evidence, gathering detailed info and sworn testimonies directly from thousands of farmers. Thousands. He built an ironclad, data-driven case against the landlords, and it was this overwhelming mountain of documented evidence that successfully forced the government to set up an official inquiry into the sharecroppers' situation. Unsurprisingly, the inquiry overwhelmingly found the landlords guilty of illegal extortion. But here's the catch. The British landlords, likely trying to save face and preserve some status, offered to refund just 25% of the illegally collected money to the farmers. And surprisingly, Gandhi strategically accepted it. The deadlock was broken.
Now you're probably wondering, why on earth would he settle for just a fraction of the money when the landlords were so clearly in the wrong? Well, the answer is that this victory was never purely about the cash. Gandhi's main aim here was to restore the peasants' self-respect and confidence. By forcing the landlords to surrender even a portion of the money, he essentially forced them to surrender a portion of their prestige and their perceived absolute power over the region.
And the long-term result? Quote, "Soon the oppressive Indigo system comes to an end." By breaking that psychological hold and proving that the landlords were not above the law, Gandhi struck a fatal blow to the whole system. Within a few years, the British planters abandoned their estates entirely, the land reverted back to the peasants, and that officially ended Indigo sharecropping in Champaran forever.
But Gandhi's vision for leadership and justice didn't stop at resolving a farming dispute. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, True Freedom Beyond Money.
Once the economic battle was won, Gandhi saw the deep cultural and social poverty going on in the Champaran villages. He realized that true social reform required building up the community from within. I mean, freeing them from the landlords was only step one. Freeing them from systemic poverty and a lack of education, that was step two. So, he pushed for widespread, lasting improvements in three main areas: education, health, and sanitation. He called in volunteers, teachers, and doctors from across the country to help uplift the community. He was fundamentally teaching them self-reliance. He knew that for justice to be sustainable, the people needed the practical tools to maintain their own well-being and dignity over the long haul. And that brings us to the most profound takeaway from Lewis Fisher's account. True freedom isn't just the absence of an oppressive landlord. It's the state achieves when people finally overcome fear and discover the courage to stand up for justice. The absolute greatest victory for these farmers wasn't a 25% financial payout. It was the fact that they learned they had rights, they learned they had defenders, and above all, they learned courage.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought derived from this incredible historical text. The peasants of Champaran found their courage by standing together behind a man who simply refused to back down. So if true freedom begins when we overcome fear, what is your first step toward justice? Think about what fears might be holding you back in your own life or community, and how you might take that first, persistent step, just like Rajkumar Shukla did. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning, keep learning.